pleasure, honor, and privilege to welcome you all for this event. It is actually hosted by the Indian School of Business Center for B2B Markets. And a word about CBM, that is Center for Business Markets. Initially, for the last 1 year of its existence, it's just about a year and a few months beyond a year. It was focused on B2B marketing, but several of our member companies came back and said, look, we also operate in both B2B and B2C. And then we did some soul searching and said the lines are actually becoming hazy and fuzzy. And that input was also received from several industry leaders who said they operate in both, and actually while there are nuances of each, there are also some convergence that's happening. So right now, when we say Center for Business Markets, it encompasses both B2B and B2C. And this is the research center within ISB, which is trying to make a bridge between academia and industry. And I'm happy to welcome on behalf of ISB CBM all the attendees to this webinar. We have two tracks of this webinar. One is called the knowledge dissemination and the other is called knowledge creation. What knowledge creation means is there is a faculty, top-end faculty in the particular sub area of B2B marketing or B2C marketing, who is trying to develop a new body of knowledge which is of contemporary interest, and that needs to be tested out. And for the purpose of showcasing that knowledge, which is work in progress, and validating it, we thought it's a great idea to have the academic who is spearheading that research in first present it for about 20 minutes and then have a conversation or feedback from very senior industry practitioners. So today's session comes under what is called Knowledge Creation Series. Every alternate month we'll have a knowledge creation series. The other month will be knowledge dissemination. That is pre-existing knowledge, which may be in the form of a master class by an academic or a very senior industry practitioner. And he will be coupled with an academic and or practitioner. And there'll be a very vigorous dialogue that will benefit the participants. At the end of an hour or 55 minutes, we'll have a 15-minute Q&A. That's the format. So this is one of the many offerings of ISB CBM. In addition, we have a whole lot of other things such as programs, research, consulting, a lot of hand-holding, developing white papers, writing case studies. And for all of that, you're welcome to visit our website, and I'm sure that towards the end, we'll get a chance to share our email ID. Otherwise, if you go to ISB and just search for ISB CBM, you will find it. We are very easy to locate. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome the four panelists who are going to be on this. The main speaker, as I said, because it's a knowledge creation, is Professor Madhu Viswanathan. It's actually his body of knowledge that he's trying to present today for about 20 minutes. And the whole thing is called activity-based incentives. He's a PhD from Minnesota, and also he worked in the US in Arizona as a professor and recently relocated to India. So he has interest in B2B marketing, primarily in distribution, sales, and many related aspects, including the leveraging of technology for sales, distribution, and in general B2B marketing and sales. So he'll be the main speaker, and this is a recent area of his research which will culminate into a very scholarly article. He's already published several articles in marketing and sales in the top journals of marketing in the world, and he's a very acclaimed scholar. Anchoring this session will be Raghuram Bommaraju, who is again a very young faculty like Madhu, and he did his PhD, his XLRA MBA many years back. Worked for several years in corporates in India, including Spencer's Group. And then he went to University of Houston, where he completed his PhD. And he worked as a professor at Iowa State University before joining ISB recently. And his areas of interest are in sales. I believe agnostic whether it's B2B or B2C. And it's good to have people like him because we are trying to make bridges between these two worlds and not treat them as distinct entities, B2B and B2C. So he's also highly published, and he's got very, very creditable articles in top journals like Journal of Marketing and so on. We have also on this forum today two industry speakers. They are very, very senior, and it's a pleasure and privilege to have them here with us. The first is Satya Mahesh. His formal designation is Director of Business Excellence at MCure Pharmaceuticals, and he has about 30 years of experience, a hardcore sales person in the pharma industry, also done a lot of work in business excellence, which is obviously needed, sales force excellence, and then strategy. He started his career as a medical rep, but obviously he was hugely successful because the pharma industry has zero tolerance for non-performers in the sales force, and therefore if you're good, you just get to climb very rapidly, and that's what he precisely did. He was in top MNCs, including Hext Pharma, which is a very global giant in pharma, and he's also author of a couple of books on in healthcare, especially on diabetes and epilepsy. He's quite a prolific writer, and basically he has a keen desire to learn, to contribute, and grow. Also on this panel, we have Ajay Mishra, who is Chief of Marketing, Construction and Commercial at Tata Steel. As you know, Tata Steel is an exemplar of in sales and marketing in the country for sure, and a lot of people, including me, have been for a long time students of some of the incredible work that they have been doing in terms of customer value management, retail value management, application of theory of business, theory of constraints in sales and marketing, and so on. By basic training, he's an electrical engineer, and he completed his MBA from XLRI and has about 30 years experience again. So you're talking of two very, very senior people who are on this panel to sort of listen to, constructively critique Madhu Viswanathan's work, and hopefully that will feed into enhancing the practical connection of Madhu's work to the world of practice. And like all senior managers and high growth leaders in Tata Steel, Ajay has been moved through several functions, and that's the nature of how high potential top leaders are put through. So while starting in sales, then he did a stint in marketing, international business, business planning, market planning, human resources, project planning, and also on-site executions for projects. He's been very closely working with Tata Steel on its growth journey. It has literally become 3 or 4 times its size in the last 10 years. And he has spearheaded many TQM initiatives and continuous improvement programs of Tata Steel. What is interesting about the two industry people on this panel is also that one comes from an industry where people are incentivized. That's the nature of the beast, the pharma industry. Your salary and as a sales guy is heavily linked to the performance, and there's a very, very heavy component of performance incentives. On the other end of the spectrum is Tata Steel, which does not give monetary incentives to its sales force, and that is a philosophical and cultural issue with the group. Although to their distributors, their structure, the distributor sales force gets incentives. So anyway, you will hear from the horse's mouth both these philosophies, why they work, why they don't work, and so on. And to marry all these together, we have Madhu Viswanathan, who's going to try and take a very different perspective on should incentives be outcome-based, as in sales, or should it be activity-based? Under what circumstances are activity-based incentives valid? Should they be given to sales guys? Should they be given to managers of sales guys? So there are dozens of questions that arise, and this will be very thought-provoking. To anchor this session, we have Professor Raghuram Bommaraju. As I said, he has lasting and very stable in sales and sales incentives. And without further ado, I'd like to hand over the session to Raghu to actually conduct it all to the very end. And with that, I'm sure the participants on this program will have huge learning. Once again, just remind you, we will close sharp at 7:15. That's based on feedback in the last several webinars that there was not enough time for Q&A. Therefore, we want to provide 15 to 20.
Thank you, DVR. So thank you for the introductions and setting the stage for the today's seminar. So just to add to what DVR already mentioned, so the basic idea behind this seminar is to bridge the gap between academia and practice. So many of us might have an MBA degree and then we move into the practice, and we may not necessarily go back and read many of the journal articles. And at the same time, whoever we are working in academics, so we do a lot of interesting research, and our struggle is to make it more relevant for practice. So the hope is that forums like this will bridge the gap, so it gives us as academics a chance to look at what is happening in practice and make our research more practice relevant. After all, we are in the business management research, so we would love for our research to be actually actionable and implemented in the field. And at the same time, the hope is that it will inform the practice and practitioners. Hopefully, they will learn a thing or two from our research, and that will make the relationship stronger. And if you look at the Western world, the universities and the industries collaborate intensively there, and definitely in the sciences and also in the management field. So we at ISB are hoping that we can start the initiative and may bridge that gap, which should benefit all the parties involved. So without much delay, I'll just hand over it to Madhu. Before that, the session, as DVR mentioned, so there will be roughly 20 minutes of presentation by Madhu, followed by, let's say, 30 to 35 minutes of discussion between Mahesh, Ajay, Madhu, and myself. And the last 15 to 20 minutes we'll reserve for the Q&A. So if you have any questions, yeah, clarifying or any deep questions that you may have, please type in the Q&A box. I'll try to monitor that. So I might be looking away from the webcam once in a while. So please uh, don't mistake me. I'm only looking at the questions that you're typing here. So that's all, Madhu. So you can go ahead and start.
Thank you, Raghu. Thanks, BVR, for that wonderful introduction, and thanks to ISB CVM for organizing this webinar series. I'm actually very excited. Like Raghu said, one of the greatest joys of being an academic is to have your research talked about, especially among practitioners, and seeing some aspects of it at least being discussed and implemented. So this is a research work that we started quite a few years back. It's called Do Activity-Based Incentives Work? Evidence from a Large-Scale Field Intervention. This is joint work with faculty members, Professor Raghu Rao at University of Texas at Austin, Professor George John, who is a faculty member at University of Minnesota, and Sunil Kishore, who is a junior partner at McKinsey Consulting. Now, I'm going to jump into what we are actually talking about. So before we do that, it's useful to think of where sales research stands. Okay. Now, we do know that sales is extensive, okay? But if you want to put numbers to it, right, how big it is useful to know that at least in the US, Salesforce management exceeds almost like $800 billion. Okay, so we are hitting almost close to $1 trillion on expenditure in sales. So it is such a huge market, and it is useful to talk about, what are the things that go into incentive plans? How do we motivate people? So these are all very important things just from an economic point of view. You're not talking about a car salesperson alone. Even though they are important, there's ample opportunities in sales just because of the amount of money we spent on sales. Now, there is a huge interest among academics and practitioners to understand this relationship between what happens with incentives and how does it influence productivity, right? At the end of the day, that's what it's all about. How do I improve performance? Now, one of the things that has happened over the last decade or so is the availability of data. Before it was very difficult to keep track of sales and effort and so on. But with advances in computing system, advances with reporting, one of the big advantages is that we have micro level data that can actually help us answer a lot of these Salesforce related questions. And we can figure out what are these implications for firm strategies. one of the things that is actually growing a lot nowadays is this area called people analytics, which is about understanding individual salespeople, understanding individual people in the organization, and figuring out how to make things, both from an incentive perspective and from an organization perspective, figuring out what works, what doesn't, and helping them perform better. Right? So this is where we are as far as research goes. Now, even here, there are clearly lots of gaps. There's lots of issues to be tackled because we have just opened the floodgates on these things. Now, what we are going to focus on is something called activity-based incentives. Activity-based incentives, and I'll define what I mean by activity in my particular study, but it is anything which is related to the task at hand. Okay, so as an academic, my activity could be coming to office on a regular basis, reading, a certain number of papers, teaching certain number of classes. All of these could be activities, right? And then the performance could be how I perform, let's say, on the number of papers I publish, number of cases I write, and my scores on teaching evaluation. So that would be my output variable. So activity is essentially the effort that is related to the performance, right? Now, activity-based incentives, where you're actually paying people to do certain activities, is pretty popular. Okay, so there's a Zoltner's et al. Paper or report that essentially suggests that at least 15% of the firms they surveyed incorporate activity signals into incentives. And I think this is just based on the entire industry as well. There are certain industries like pharma, for example, where activity-based incentives are very popular. Okay? Now, the question, therefore, is what is the effect of activity-based incentives? Do they really work? Okay? Are they just increasing activity without increasing the performance? Can we get better in the sense that instead of doing activity-based incentives, can you just pay on performance-based measures like sales and be done with activity-based incentives, use the activity score sheet for something else, right? And then who do you incentivize? So all of these are questions that are out there where firms are employing it, but they don't have concrete answers on, okay, is it working? Can we do better? Is there something else to work on? So these are the questions, and we are hoping that we'll be able to answer at least some of them in our research. The second part that is interesting is a lot of times the focus is on the frontline salesperson, but not on the manager who's managing these frontline salespeople. Okay? And it is very important, especially when it comes to activity-based incentives, because at the end of the day, okay, these activities are monitored and supervised by these frontline managers. And so to understand how they play a role in this whole ecosystem is another aspect that we're going to study. Okay. Now, we're going to, in our setting, it's essentially a call report. And it's a subjective call report where basically salespeople are going to report what they did. Right? Now, this is monitored and supervised by the manager, and he gets to have he or she gets to have some kind of veto authority on what is acceptable and what's not. Right? Some kind of auditing responsibility falls on the manager. And so it is important to understand, okay, what is the manager doing? And that's another aspect that we're going to study. So going back, key research question we're going to answer is whether these activity-based incentives improve productivity. And by productivity, we mean sales performance. And then we're going to look at the factors that affect these ABIs. When do they work best and when do they not work as well? Right? And then the second part is, of course, should salespeople or the managers be the locus of these effects? Should you be incentivizing both? Should you be incentivizing just the salesperson? Should you be incentivizing just the manager? Those are the questions we're hoping to address. Now, what is the context in which we're going to study this? It's actually a large Indian pharmaceutical firm. It has around 611 salespeople. They have quite a lot of territories. They're across India, so they're nationalistic in their reach. So they have around 305 territories. Now, salespeople are either assigned to single or multiple sales territories. So, there could be a territory, let's say like Bombay, where there are multiple salespeople assigned to it. Each one has a certain area designated to it, but they all report to Bombay. And I'll tell you very soon why that is important. Now, if you think about the compensation plan that they have, so most of them get some combination of a fixed plus group commission on sales, and then incentives on effort. This was the incentive plan that we introduced. And then there is a call report where there's some measurement of effort. So number of doctor visits, the medical coverage region, so the area that is covered, pharmacy visits, and so on. Now, what did we do? So we did something which is called a treatment removal design. Right? Now, I'm going to give you a little bit about why what we're doing is important. A lot of times, it's important to understand that the needle you're moving is the one that's leading to the change. Okay, so if I increase incentives, suppose I start paying a salesperson more money, I want to know that that money is actually what is leading to the increase in performance. This is very difficult to do in real time because along with the change that you have done, where you have increased the money that is going to be paid to the salesperson, something else is also happening. Okay. In addition, there might be trends going on. Let's say you changed it during a lean period versus a peak period. So there will be all those changes and seasonalities that are going on. And so when we look at the impact of this, we are trying to assess in a very causal manner that, when I tell you that ABIs work, it is indeed ABIs that are going to lead to the increase in performance and not necessarily anything else. Okay, and so that's why we come up with these experimental designs, which will help us accommodate these factors. Okay, we're able to take care of all other situations that you can think of, which could be leading to an increase in sales, and we're able to control for that in statistical jargon and address those issues and come to the conclusion that it is indeed ABIs that lead to the effect. Now, the way we have designed this experiment, so in the first year, it was a status quo, which was just the sales plan that they had. The second period, we gave ABI incentives for both managers and salespeople. Okay. Now, in the period 2 of our intervention, we took away the incentives for the salespeople and only the managers had the incentives. And then in the last period of our intervention, we basically took away the incentives also for the managers. Okay. So during this period of intervention, people essentially got paid for their activities. So that's the treatment period, what we call the treatment period. And in the rest of the periods, they didn't get paid. And now, once we do this, what we're going to see is, okay, during the period that they got paid for it, we held everything else constant. Okay, what is the impact on sales? Right? Now, before I jump into the results, what I do want to quickly tell you is, if you think about the salesperson's task, this is a standard pharma setting. Okay, so the salesperson's job is to present information, provide drug samples, make product presentation. Now, all the salespeople in this division carry the same line of products. They do not work in teams or make joint calls. Now, they do make pharmacy calls, as most people in India will, salespeople working in the pharma sector in India will. They differ in purpose and content from those of doctor calls. All right, so this is essentially what their task is. If you look at their activity signal, so they're going to collect this call report. Physicians visited, pharmacies visited, non-listed physicians visited, percentage of medical coverage. This is what is tracked, right? And these are self-reported numbers. So one thing that you have to remember is, if I give you incentives, let's say on the number of doctor visits, and you're actually required to, report this number, there is a chance that you might be fudging these numbers. You might be misreporting these numbers because there is money involved in it. Okay, and this is where the alignment with the manager comes in. Okay. I'm not saying that everybody does this, but there is a scope for, pushing around the numbers, maybe push it around till the end of this quarter and take it later up. Okay, so all of those could happen. Okay, so these numbers are potentially biased. Okay, so what are the sales signals? The sales signals that we have are basically, your sales, final sales. Now, the key thing to remember here is that in territories which have multiple salespeople, it is very difficult to track the sales to one individual salesperson. And so the way the company deals out incentives or makes payment based on performance is it divides it equally among all the salespeople in that particular territory. So whenever you have multiple territories, there's a good chance that some salespeople are doing very well and some salespeople are not. Okay. And so over and above that, what we're going to do is we're going to give them incentives on activities. Right. So that's essentially the sales signal. Okay. Now I'm going to tell you all the controls we did. So we basically looked for a lot of pattern matching. So what we mean is we looked at whether territories which had more salespeople and where it's difficult to figure out who actually, what actually led to the sale, do those territories perform differently than territories with single salespeople? Okay. Then we change the unit of analysis. It could be that we are looking at the salesperson level, but the actual effects and actual action is happening at the territory or at the country level. So we did look at those differences also. Okay. Now we also looked at heterogeneous effects, which is, does it vary across territories? Does it vary across salespeople? We looked at something called as attrition. We do know that salespeople, there are new salespeople coming in all the time. There are salespeople leaving the firm as well. That could be leading to differences in what we have found. And so we looked at those aspects also. We also looked at carryover, right? So salespeople, whenever there are incentives involved, there is popular saying that, I will make sure I get the incentive this one, and I will push my targets over, or I will carry forward sales, or push sales over to the next month if I'm not going to hit the targets. So we look at carryover effects also in our setup. And then we also look at geography level differences, right? In the sense that prescriptions written in one territory may be filled in a pharmacy in an adjacent territory. So if you look at territories which are close by, is that a problem in our effect? So we looked at all these things, okay? And what we find is two things, okay? So this is consistently true even after controlling for all these effects. One is that ABIs, activity-based incentives, are increasing sales productivity. So when we mean sales productivity, we are not talking about activities, okay? We are not even worried about what activities happen. What we do see is final sales, okay? Activity-based incentives are going to improve your sales performance by about 8%. And this increase is much more in territories where signals are noisy. So think about multiple territories, right? In those areas, you get a higher bump for activity-based incentives. The next thing we found is that the impact of these activity-based incentives works in two ways. One is it generally increases output when both the salesperson and the manager, supervisor are both paid. It also increases the control exerted by the supervisor. So the supervisor actually ends up being the deciding factor in all of this, right? So if you look at the outcomes that happen, the marginal increase in output when both were incentivized, both salesperson and manager were incentivized, versus only supervisor incentivized, you find that the ROI is actually better when you incentivize only the managers. So the takeaway is that, even though you want the salesperson to increase the activity, you are actually better off paying just the manager to do it, because the manager is the one who is actually doing the control and allocation over you. Okay, so you may actually step back and say, from an ROI perspective, I don't have to pay both of them. I just have to pay one. Okay, and that's what we find. So what are the key conclusions? The key conclusions that we have are activity-based incentives are very valuable. They do increase sales performance, and they increase sales performance, especially when the signals are very noisy. So whenever I cannot, clearly identify that the performance, the sales output, is the result of a salesperson's effort, in those times, ABIs work great. Right? In other times, they're okay, they work, but you might be better off doing something else, like paying just on sales could be an option. Right? Now, the other key thing is that supervisors are the locus of control, which means that incentivize supervisors on these things and you're good to go. Right? So that's about it in a nutshell. So if you have any clarification questions, I will take it. Otherwise, it's back to you, Raghu.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Madhu. So I have a couple of clarifying questions. So so you said year one is when they have no activity-based incentives, right? And year two, you said there's a period one and period two. So can you clarify how long is period one and how long is period two?
Right. So period one was around 6 months.
Okay.
And period two was a period of 3 months.
Period of 3 months. Okay. So the starting year where you don't have any activity-based incentives, and the next 6 months is when you have incentives for both salespeople and managers. The
Yes.
next 3 months is when you have incentives only for the managers,
Managers, that's right.
right? And then you have the following year's data. Is that right?
Like when they had no incentives. Now, remember
Okay.
that we do have the firm was always collecting call reports.
Right.
It was
Okay.
not that call reports were not being collected, it is just that they were not being incentivized. So you
Okay.
can get paid for doing this.
Okay. Okay. That's good to know. So the second question I had was, so what percentage of the variable component is assigned to the activity-based incentives? So how
So
much?
in this case, it was very less. I think it was less than like 5%. Like it varied, of course, but around 2.5 to 4% was the number I remember.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you. Um, Anybody else? So Mahesh or Ajay, if you have any clarifying questions, so we can first go with those, and then we can go at the more deeper questions. Mahesh, you're mute. You're on mute.
uh, Madhu, one thing that needs to be possibly be mentioned is that during this period they do have their routine sales incentives were also a part of the incentive plan. Additionally, the ABI incentives have been added.
Correct.
Yeah.
Ajay, do you have any questions at this point of time?
No. I'm fine, but typically these examples in B school mostly is towards pharma FMCG, and I would love to see more examples of manufacturing and B2B space. So that's the only point on this work which is there. That's all. But we can take it offline.
Okay, yeah, thanks. So maybe let me just start with the discussion about, so this is a formal context, so I think that's where Ajay also probably pointing. So how prevalent are these kind of incentives in your respective industries? Mahesh, maybe you can go first.
Yeah. I mean, these are very prevalent. I mean, the earlier time, some 10 years back and all that, there were three simple principles of incentives where they always said that recognize the efforts or the activities, recognize them, so in some meetings and all that, you actually tell them that you have done well, gives a small token of appreciation and all that. Then the second point was reward the sales because you generate the revenue for the organization, they are being rewarded. And award the overall excellence, where both sales as well as the activities are the best. You do give them the awards once in a year, maybe a meeting elsewhere, I mean, outside the country or an annual meeting. That's the usual practice earlier. Now, for the last 10 years, a large number of companies have actually moved to efforts-based incentives. Not that efforts-based incentives would be separated from the sales incentives and all that. You have once again approximately about three different kinds of methods where it is used when it comes to the question of efforts. Especially some organizations consider wherever there are high efforts or high activities, it gives a multiplier effect to the existing incentives, which are and I mean it is also used as a penalty clause that you have to actually do certain amount of effort, then only actually you would be eligible for the incentive. So it's more like a hurdle which needs to be crossed. So that's another one. And then rewarding sales and awarding excellence continues to be the norm. So to say, it is very relevant, and as pharma is mostly in terms of prescription generation. The whole pharma business is all about prescription generation and building a brand which would actually add more value to the patients that who are using the brand. And it is well known that good activity or good efforts would build a brand. And the very recent COVID, we have seen that those brands which were built on strong prescriptions have done exceedingly well despite having difficulties in terms of access to the doctors and all that. So that's one wonderful example, where you can say that, you have to have great activities to actually build great brands. And today the norm for pharmaceutical industry is like that. I mean, there were three simple fundamental rules which every pharmaceutical industry follows is that it should have planned sales, progressive sales, and profitable sales. And this is what is actually a norm which every company follows, whether they follow these three words or not. But the essence of the whole management is that planned, progressive, and profitable sales. And if you have to actually generate this, you need to have performance through process, which will give you sustainable sales. So,
Mahesh, if I can just stop you for a second. So you made an interesting observation that so this change or emphasis on activity-based incentives wasn't there, like let's say 15 years back. So
yes,
is there any trigger for that, or why companies have suddenly started showing more importance for such incentives?
yes. I mean, it's like, in the last 15 years, the last 10, 15 years, there are large number of brands which were built, and people have understood that if you have to build a brand, then you have to follow a standard process which is time tested. I mean, especially in pharma, it is very, very simple. You reach the doctor. I mean, it's all about call counts, how much of calls that you make. Are you making the right call? Are you talking about the right brand and the right key message that you are talking to the doctor? It's finally boils down to that, and how good you are. So, which needs actually a good process is understood that, you have to actually follow this kind of process to bring sustainable sales. It's not that you do sales 1 month or 2 months and then be happy about it, but you need to bring in sustainable sales, and that every company has realized if you have to bring that, doctors are the most important stakeholders where you have to generate your business through prescriptions.
Okay,
Uh,
yeah. So that's great to know, Mahesh. So in other words, what you're saying is that increase in competition in the marketplace might have forced or realized that the discipline in the sales is also very important. So it's not just the end revenues, but the way that you're achieving that
yes.
probably can negate any fluctuations in the market, any economic shocks that you might be experiencing.
Sure, it's definitely true. I mean, there are many scenarios that we have gone through in the last few years, be it the demonetization, be it the GST, or be it the COVID. We have seen that those brands which have those products which have become brands have actually got very sustainable sales, and the losses even during those tough times have been quite minimal. That is why
Okay.
today large number of organizations believe in activity-based incentives. Once again, it's like there are few organizations, mostly MNCs, which give direct incentives on the activities or the efforts which the field force would be exerting. Like once again, it depends on what are those kind of activities that you want to incentivize. Depends on the kind of therapy area that you are in, or the kind of difficulty. Especially, say for example, if it is a very, very common brand, or it's very commonly used brand, what you need to have is a wider reach. So
Right.
possibly incentivize that. If you have a niche market, obviously you need to. It's more of a frequency driven model, or now with the COVID times, the frequency has shifted. But at the end of the day, it's more touch points. Earlier it was frequency through face to face. Now it's more touch points, be it digital, or be it reaching out to the doctors through various other modes. So the direct incentive is considered on activities by good number of multinational companies. In some organizations, activities are used as a multiplier to the existing sales incentives, which is already announced. So if you do 100% with your moderate activities, you get say X money, and if you exceed your activities, you actually get X plus something. So it's used as a multiplier.
Okay,
And
that's very interesting to know. Yeah,
yes, yes.
yeah. Thank you, Mahesh. So let me now turn to Ajay, and I know, like as DVR mentioned, Tata, at least Tata Steel has a very different philosophy on the incentives. Ajay, so what's your take on what Madhu has presented and what Mahesh has just discussed? So, in other words, so do you think these kind of incentives are relevant for Tata Steel, and why or why not?
Thanks for the question. But before I proceed, I just want to tell all our fellow members, take COVID pause, be safe, maintain social distancing, wear mask, and your hygiene. So I have all the panel members as well as all the tech, so that my COVID pause to start with.
Thank
Before I give perspectives on Tata Steel, I think relevance of this topic I wanted to touch on a little bit. And relevance of this topic of activity-based incentive uh, is first is from a time perspective. Every time when we have gone through a crisis, everybody has looked up to the sales force to enhance, the profitability, bottom line. The role is become very critical. If everything is smooth, still the role of sales team is very high. That's more from a point of view of timing perspective that it is a very important subject. Second is we also need to understand the kind of technological shift which is happening, relevant and important, whether it will take a different shape and form in the world of digital, whether activity-based incentives will be driven more from these technology and digital perspective. And the third point is that we also need to see, the way our personal experiences are influencing the incentive. So with both Gen Y coming into the final, either from a buyer side or from the timing perspective, from the digital perspective, the relevance of this topic is pretty high, and we need to constantly search how we can evolve these topics of activity-based incentives. From Tata Steel standpoint, first we need to tell you that how we incentivize people in Tata Steel, and then why we say, second part is that why we say that the activity-based incentive will be the only way or way, especially for our sales team. So we have incentive plan in for giving our annual bonus, annual increment, which is typically driven by the performance metrics of an individual, and people also get recognized for doing some wonderful cross-functional projects, do some special projects. So there are multiple recognition forum which is there. So at the end of the day, incentivization is also to drive the right culture and to motivate people. From the production point of view, we have some productivity improvement, some incentive drive, which is being taken, that incentive linked to the productivity. So we typically reward for the team, we reward for the company success, and that's how the incentive philosophy is there in Tata Steel. Let me highlight the cornerstone of a triangle, that why activity-based incentive in an organization like ours, which is heavy on manufacturing, uh, it's not necessary always. So first point is the type of industry that we are in. It is very difficult to say that incentive be given only to the people. It is a through and through process. If there is a raw material who has done a lot of work for mining activity, then the operation team for production, then the maintenance team, technology team, whole lot of people, supply chain, all of them are hugely involved in this journey. So it is very difficult to say whether it is to be incentivized to the sales team, and that's one side of the corner triangle where we. Second side of the triangle is what we are driving in our organization. What's our strategic objective? Is it the push sales or the pull sales? Are we selling the value or we are selling the product? Are we selling the convenience or we are selling the product? So, a lot of things. So people are in our company, we are graduating to sell solution. Again, it calls for a lot of engagement for people. So what is the aim for the organization and strategic objective of the organization is critical. Third, in the last corner of the triangle that I wanted to talk about is the structure of the organization, which is in terms of whether you reach, whether you're trying more of a B2B, whether you're trying to do more of a B2C, what is the expectations of people, what people give the priority to, whether it is the incentive is the priority or learning is the priority. Lot depends on that. So large organization like ours, which is heavy on manufacturing, driving the activity based incentive only for the sales people, not across the function, is something which is very critical. And what we are driving is not a push sales but the pull sales. And that's the comment which I would like to give and place before you.
Thanks, Ajay. So actually, even though we studied in a Salesforce context, you're very right. I think what we are focusing on can be applied to other settings also, where the emphasis is different. I actually joke with my colleagues here about how I come to office regularly, and so they should as faculty members they should be incentivizing for attendance and coming on regular time and so on. Well, as jokes aside, I think your point is well taken. That it is just suggesting that in this context it is working, but it can work in different ways in other settings.
Those become sometimes hygiene also, Professor Madhu. The activity you need to do, and we also need to see whether those activities that you have taken actually will lead to the final outcome of the organization and desired outcome.
Right. So just one side thing. So one of the things that we do find is, even though the role of activity-based incentives is towards driving process, towards setting the salesperson on something which is supposedly a long-term objective, right? It's about lifetime value. You should note that the incentives, the way we deliver them, are not directed towards that. Like if you're looking at sales outcomes, right, that is about sales in that particular month, particular quarter. Likewise, this activity is that particular month. And what we find is, even about these long-term implications that exist, these activity-based incentives actually help even with short-term outcomes. Okay, and so we do know activities help with the long-term thing, but even at the short term, they seem to have an effect. So Raghu, over to you.
Yeah, Madhu, as a follow-up question, so we have heard like two different perspectives. So for the benefit of the audience, so can you think about general circumstances when you think, or context when you think ABIs might be useful, and any recommendations on that?
Right. So one of the things that I often talk about is to think of another setting, right, where ABI activity-based stuff is very common and measured. So you can think of a call center setup, right? In call centers, you can actually monitor a lot of these activities, right? Very similar in the nature that it's about calls, number of calls, time spent on call, time spent in resolving a particular issue, sales again there if it's a sales-based call center. Mm-hmm. Now, in those setups, you can actually monitor the relationship between activity and performance very well. Mm-hmm. Okay. Now, in those settings, what our study would recommend is don't give activity-based incentives. You're better off actually incentivizing final sales. You can use activity-based reports, but you use them for different reasons. Use them maybe for promotions. Use them for saying, okay, this person has the organizational culture at hand, and so we should promote him or we should keep him in the organization. But it's not about sales. Okay, in those setups, if you're looking at sales improvement, activity-based incentives don't work. Okay, you're better off not doing it. Whereas in pharma, and especially in these multiple sales territories, right, the big problem is saying, okay, in Bombay where there are 8 salespeople, I don't know, which salesperson's effort led to that final sale at the pharmacy. Okay, and now if I want to motivate those kind of setups, what we find is, here I don't know the relationship between sales and effort very well. In those setups, give activity-based incentives. So even within the same industry, right? So we have these differences in single territory and multiple territories, right? What we would suggest is in single territories, you can probably don't give activity-based incentives. Just work with your performance-based incentives, and that's sufficient. Okay, or give it to the manager. They can do a better job of these things. You don't have to reward the salesperson. Okay, and so the bite for these activity-based incentives comes when this relationship between sales and effort is not very clear.
If I may just add this point, on supporting or extending what Professor Madhu mentioned, even in Tata Steel organization, we are seeing that some of the businesses, which is more like a startup type of businesses, we are trying to give the activity-based incentive a try. Some 30% will be linked to it, and then you need to probably work on some of our channel partners where we are able to see that activity-based incentive is working, because at the end of the day, you have to drive the solution. Some of the channel partners reach to a nook and corner of a district or a taluka, and that's very difficult for us. And there, the incentivizing the way pharma industry practices are there on activity-based incentive work. While I have said largely the viewpoint is activity-based incentive is not there, but to answer your question, like Google, Spotify, whatever you talk about a startup, just to take a reference. So there are businesses within Tata Steel which is more to drive solutions, more to drive newness, more to drive startup kind of businesses. There it works, and we are trying our way out. Okay.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Ajay. I think the Madhu, that's a very good example of where the activity-based incentives may not be necessary. So there are a couple of, I think we're coming close to 7 p.m. So there are a couple of questions here from the audience. So one of the questions is, so our self-reported activities, so which when the salesperson is reporting themselves, so are they prone to kind of gaming the system in some sense? And why you didn't observe that in your study? So maybe Madhu can go first, and then maybe we can go to the practitioners and ask why, will they trust something that the salesperson has reported, and would you like to incentivize them that, or are there more better mechanisms? As Ajay was mentioning, maybe with technology, are there other things that one can do to track these activities? Madhu, you're on mute.
So quick answer is, I generally like to trust people. I believe in the, humanity of things. So without evidence, it's difficult to, say they are cheating or whatever. Now, is there an element of bias in it? I think there would be. The way we structure incentives often leads to consequences that we are not, that are not desirable. And, you can't fault them for it because, the way we designed it. And that is why what we are showing is actually more surprising than normal, right? What we are showing is, even if there is bias, even if you think the reporting is false, okay, forget the reporting which is done by them on paper, their self-report. Look at the accounting numbers, the sales, right? You see an increase in sales, and at the bottom, that's the thing that firms care about. And you are finding this effect. Okay, so I think a lot of times we spend time in monitoring, and monitoring becomes the end goal. Organization needs to step back and say, monitoring is a part of the process. So what? So what if they do it? Okay, at the end of the day, objectives being met. If they are, yes, let's see if we can design a better incentive plan. Otherwise, let's move on with what works.
Thanks, Madhu, for that. So, Mahesh, do you have? Since you work in the former, you're on mute. Can you unmute yourself?
Yes, Professor Raghu. Dishonesty is there everywhere. It's more a human trait rather than anything. But I genuinely believe it's very, very small, and you can actually go with these self-reported ones, and they do give a kind of results. As Madhu says that the results speak for themselves. That's one. But however, not all activity-based incentives need to be only on call counts. There are a lot of activity-based incentives which are more like how do you assess your skill score? The frontline manager can actually assess the skill score. Then how is their knowledge score? Because pharma industry or any industry for that matter, the salespeople should have the knowledge of their domain as well as the competitors and his own product. So there are other factors, which can also be checked into, which are more or less like the activity based incentives only. So it differs from, as I said, it differs from therapy to therapy, brand to brand, industry to industry. What kind of activity based incentives that you really look at. And a lot of doctors meetings also do happen today. The regulation needs that the doctors meetings are to be recorded, doctors meetings are to be actually be done. So it's very unlikely that a lot of false reporting happens. Majority of them is done and reported.
So are you leveraging technology in any way to track some of these activities?
There is technology which has been tried. Like today you have the GPS trackers. You can actually do that, but it's actually a loss of trust. And there were cases in US where people, the medical representatives have actually put a case on the company that I'm being tracked even when I am off the duty. So it's more to do with the privacy issues and all that, and possibly it's not fair on an organization to go beyond a point unless until you actually tell people that your GPS, that we follow your GPS. Because today Salesforce automation tools come with the GPS tracking also. It's for the organization to decide that whether they want to communicate and then tell the people and still implement it. But Salesforce always need a bit of flexibility. So it's always better to trust people, and trust begets trust.
No, I completely agree with that, Mahesh. I think there is a limit to how much you want to monitor an employee in an organization, right? So there has to be a certain relationship with the employee and a
Yes.
certain trust with the employee. So we cannot go to the extreme. And after all, they're helping the firm, and it's I think a mutual relationship.
Exactly.
So with that, let me go to Ajay and ask him about the same question. So I understand you don't give incentives for the activities, but do you track the activities, or do you kind of encourage, or do you monitor? Like a sales manager, does a manager sit with the salesperson and talk about, okay, where did you go this week? Whom all did you meet? So what happens even in the absence of you actually giving a monetary reward?
Yeah. So first of all, let me tell you this is a heavy process with the company. So whether in terms of tracking, if you are visiting, you have to log a customer visit reports, and the moment you log a customer visit report, you come to know that what is the quality of report, how many times he has visited a customer. Okay, so that's one. Fundamentally, on in the aspect of self-report, this is to us drive the culture of the organization. You cannot keep chasing and chasing beyond a point. If I wish to do something, and that's basically cultural drive. So probably people need not come to punch or that I have entered office at 9 a.m. And if 8 a.m. he has gone and visited some customer, we would encourage him to visit the customer rather than coming to the office. And that's where to drive the culture that yes, you have to punch, but not required. You can go and visit the customer, try and do that. The last point I wanted to say that again, in across the organization, not related to the sales per se, but self-declaration, a lot of policy which is trying to have the culture of self-certification of the bill, of your travel, safety declaration, health declaration. All these are something which is again driving culture. So I think this is very, very important from driving the organization culture, at the self-declaration perspective, and also in a way drive the agility of the organization. You know, so that's the view we have on the subject.
Thanks, Ajay, for that. I think we have definitely very interesting perspectives here. End of the day, we have to figure out what context these kind of incentives work. So I think we have time for a couple of more questions here. So let me look at some of them here that Asta has messaged me. Madhu, probably this question is for you from Sachin. So along with the ABIs, so that is the positive reinforcement, was there any negative reinforcement in place to strengthen the performance of the salespeople? I'm not exactly sure what does he mean by negative reinforcement, but if you have, if you have any insights on that.
So, going back to what Mahesh was talking about, all these salespeople throughout the period, right? Not just during an incentive period, had this qualifier thing in their setup.
Okay.
Okay, so they needed to do a certain minimum level of activities, no matter what, to qualify for incentives, any kind of incentives. Okay, so that one was there, but that was not changed at any point in our intervention. Okay, so think of it as saying, I'm holding this constant. So whatever reinforcement was there, everything was the same. The only thing I changed was I'm giving you a reward here, and I want to see if the reward actually helped change your performance.
Okay, so in other words, if I am a salesperson, by following these or doing these activities, I can actually make more money. So keeping everything else constant. Is that right?
Yeah. And so there was this qualifier, right? So that was there all throughout.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks a lot for the clarification. So anything else here that is relevant? Let me just. Okay, I think we have covered the other questions already. So let me go to the final question. I think in the COVID time, we can't end a discussion without talking about COVID. So how has the pandemic changed the incentives? So either the total incentives or the activity-based incentives. So in my opinion, I was thinking because you cannot reach or you cannot expect the sales to happen in this month or in this week, the focus might have increased on activity-based incentives because at least you can ask the salesperson to do the right things. Maybe you don't get the output in the same period, but at least you are keep calling the customers, you are continuing to follow up with the customer. So has the importance of activity-based incentives increased in the COVID period? Mahesh, you can go first, and then
It's yes and no. I mean, there are good number of companies actually during the first month of the COVID period. A lot of time has been spent on training and improving and enhancing their skills. That's number one. And there's quite a bit of, and once again, as pharma is more of a knowledge based selling, the lot of training programs have been undertaken by good number of companies and improving their knowledge. So good number of companies have actually incentivized the learning. That's one part of it. That's one type of activity that's there. And the second one is you can't reach out to a doctor face to face. You can't reach out to a customer face to face. So you need a certain amount of digital adoption actually to reach out to the doctor. So that is one more thing which has been incentivized by good number of companies in the pharmaceutical industry. Where there is something called as an approved email, which is medically approved mails are there. So how many mails have been sent by the representative, and actually for those mails actually to be opened up by a doctor and all that, you need to have fair amount of relationship which must have been built over a period of time. So the how many mails, what are the click-through rates, and all those things were also incentivized. On the other hand, there are few companies where now the activities are not happening, but there is a kind of bit of push sales is also required during that COVID period, because you need to bring in certain amount of turnovers, and the cash flows are actually taken care of. So there are few companies where they have moved away from the activity-based incentives. They said for this month we can't actually measure you on the norms, so activity-based incentives we are removing, but try to achieve higher amount of sales. So it's both yes and no.
Okay, no, that's very interesting to know, because I thought it would be the other way around, but now that you're saying it, it makes sense that since I can reach the customers, maybe I should not focus on the activities, or at least I should not incentivize, let me say it that way. So I should focus on the activities, but maybe incentivizing may not be the right thing in these times.
Exactly.
On these activities. Exactly. Okay, so but you mentioned
but the activities that were incentivized were the learning, your knowledge scores, as well as your digital adoption. This digital adoption actually has gone up very considerably at a frontline sales force, which was not the case earlier. Thanks to COVID, the pharma has adopted digital to a great extent. Actually, it was a need at that point of time.
Okay, okay, that's great. Yeah, so let me go to Ajay with the same question here. So how are you managing in these times with respect to your incentives or how you're managing your sales for any advice for the audience here?
Yeah, so I think as we always say, there is an advantage in adversaries or opportunity in the current crisis. I think many things we have learned, started believing, which earlier seemed to be very, very difficult. Uh, so first and foremost, how the expectations of customers also have changed is very critical. So we used to go for sure every month. So my sales manager will go every month, meet maybe 3 months, 4 times, 5 times, even we go once in a month and have a sales call. So expectations of customers have changed. Now, what is a new way of engagement? Have we thought through? You know, when we are physically distanced, but how we are still close in terms of not having any distance on our mind. How are we going to do that? Do we have an engagement? Do we allow these kinds of digital medium to stay connected? So we are overemphasizing and re-emphasizing the need for engagement. It should not stop if you're not visiting his factory. But the moment pandemic came in, we started talking to our all customers, our CEO and managing director have spent and connected, and that shows that yes, there is a compassion behind whatever we are communicating, different way of engagement. All our distributor and channel partners, when there was a huge issue of whether you send sanitizer or mask, we sent all our dealers, distributors, whole lot of this thing to say that bulk procurement. So you say that yes, this is the time to show the care for your customers or for a distributor or a channel partner. And from the incentive perspective, and I will go back to the concept which I started. This is the time the sales API incentive or sales incentive did not get impacted because while everybody was looking for a cash flow, cash generation, different way to look at it, come out of this crisis every day, inventory selling was also happening. So we moved from sales to post sales. Still, the ABI was not active. Okay, because we everybody in the organization started having belief and subordinated towards sales to say whatever you want in the current crisis, whether you have to go for supporting the alternate business, if hospitals are constructed, hospital beds are being constructed, or something is there in the pharma industry being supplied. So everything started shifting, and that shift, that engagement, commitment, and care, and we have learned a lot during this pandemic period.
Thanks a lot, Ajay. I think you definitely give for almost all the questions you had an entirely different perspective, and it's very useful because sometimes I think we might be blinded only by one approach. But thanks a lot. I think it's really Mahesh and you bring very different perspective. Obviously, they both work in your respective industries. So one last question for Madhu, and then probably we may have to close in the interest of time. So has this, did you see other than the effect on performance? So did you see any effect of these activity based incentives on salesperson's learning or any other important metrics at the salesperson level? Madhu, you're on mute.
So, what do you mean by learning here? I was not, it was not clear.
So maybe because I'm engaging in these activities, now maybe I learned about actually how to approach a doctor, how what I do in the doctor office. So has there been an impact on that?
So, that's not clear, at least from our data. Because what we see is, these reports were always there. So they were always meeting doctors. They were, doing the same activities. And once see the interesting thing about us is we have a removal design, right? So we actually once we remove the
Incentives,
incentives,
right?
we can actually observe again changes in behavior.
Okay.
And what we see is there is a drop in the activities that they perform,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so it seems to suggest that there is that thing going on, but the learning part is unclear.
Okay. Yeah, no, I got your point. So in other words, probably there wasn't much of a learning per se, and maybe there needs some other kind of an intervention or something else that needs to be done? Because what,
Correct. Because
yeah.
see, this was not about process or quality engagement, right? This
Mm-hmm.
was just saying, I'm just, giving you incentives on just meeting people. If it
Right.
was some kind of quality metric, maybe there and much more process quality, then maybe it would have made it. I think Mahesh had something to add.
Yeah. I mean, maybe as this thing. In my experience over a period of time, I have observed that rewards buy temporary compliance. I mean, it's what I have seen over a period of time. But what is actually more important, which brings sustainable sale, is actually changing the beliefs of the field force, and so that their behaviors change and it impacts the business very positively. Just to give you a very simple example, if you are asked to get up at 4 o'clock in the morning, take cold water bath, bland diet, no, I mean celibacy for about 45 days, you would always call it as a punishment or a siksha because somebody is imposing it onto you. But if you do the same thing with your own heart and soul, especially during Ramzan in Islam, or Lent month in Christianity, or maybe Ayyappa Diksha, this all the same things that which once you felt as siksha, all of a sudden becomes a diksha. If you actually make your field force feel that there is a purpose in what they are doing. I mean, the kind of impact that you would get, the kind of seriousness that they would get into their work would be much more. Of course, it in no way says that rewards are not important, but there is something much more as a behavioral change. If you bring in, I think the organization would be much better, and the sustainability of business is far better.
Yeah, thanks, Mahesh, and thanks, Ajay, Madhu. So I think we had a wonderful discussion. So I'm sorry I'm not able to take up all the questions in the Q&A here. So, but I promise we will collate the questions and we will send a response to you for all the participants here. We'll also try to send a short summary of the discussion that we had. And I will hand over it to DVR to close the today's seminar.
Thank you, Raghu. Thank you, Madhu. Thank you to our industry friends Satya and Ajay. I think this is a brilliant session. The interactions from the participants and the two industry pehelwans who are seasoned sales gurus, having spent 3 decades each. So they're talking, they know what they're talking about. Feeds into research, research feeds into practice, and that symbiotic relationship is what ISB CBM is all about. This knowledge creation, knowledge dissemination series is all about. And it is very gratifying to see that we had at peak about 100 participants. Obviously, people have nowadays back-to-back webinars, so some of them stepped aside a little earlier. But even now, it's gratifying that we have about 65 participants. So with this, I'd sincerely like to thank Madhu for sharing his work-in-progress research. That is Madhu, and then Raghu for anchoring the session because he comes with the requisite domain expertise to sort of navigate through and make sense and piece together the different pieces, and also Ajay and Satya for really bringing very valid perspectives to feed into the research, and of course the participants for your attention and for raising very relevant questions. Please be on the lookout for every month we will have one such session. The sessions will be announced at least a month before. And how to reach us, I think it's there on the chat box. You can either write to Meenal or Asta and you will get very prompt replies. They are the two pillars that hold ISB CBM together, very experienced managers. Without further ado, have a wonderful time, and as Ajay said, have safe. This is a time for us to keep safe more than anything else. In my view, sales and incentives can wait. Safety is the first, and don't compromise on that ever. So with that, thank you all, and look forward to seeing you again. Good day.